So I think we're going to start. It's just 7:30, and we have quite a bit of work, or I guess that's the word, to do this evening. There's quite a bit of material. And if we start right away, we'll have even that much more time for the questions, which are always interesting and many. So I'm really pleased to have everybody who's here with us tonight. And I'm also pleased that Dying with Dignity Canada has organized this evening, and I thank them for the work that they've done to make this happen. The format for the evening is we'll begin with a presentation by Nora Ohanjanians, and that will take maybe half an hour. And then we'll follow up with the question and answer period with Roz Doctorow. Some of you have already sent your questions, and I have them, and we're pleased to have them. If you have questions, please direct them to me in the chat, and I will pass them on to Roz. We also have Rabbi Tina available, and she will answer questions that may be relevant to her areas of expertise. If you haven't already registered, please put your email address in the chat and direct your chat with your email to Simon Shapiro. At the end of the evening, we'll be distributing an evaluation form and also some resource materials. To do that, we need to have your email address. So please put your email address if you haven't already registered. I'll tell you a bit about our presenters, Nora, and our resource person, Roz. Nora Ohanjanians is a retired teacher, an interpreter, and a blogger. She thinks our society needs to more actively engage in discussions about end of life and wishes to contribute to Dying with Dignity Canada's efforts to raise awareness about advanced care planning and about MAID. MAID resource Dr. Rosalind Doctorow has more than 40 years of experience in the field of education. Her experience includes classroom teaching, consulting, curriculum development and writer, assessment developing, researcher, and speaker. She's currently working part-time as an adjunct professor for Nova Southeastern University. Roz believes strongly in the mission of Dying with Dignity Canada, and she works on both the outreach and education components of the GTA chapter. So those are our resource people. And before I turn it over to Nora, I'd like to invite Rabbi Tina to say just a few words.
So I am, first of all, honored to be here with you. I am always delight and take deep interest in difficult conversations. And what I mean to say by delight, I mean that when the heart is open and the mind is open, incredible things happen between people. Godliness is found in the relationship of honesty and exploration and deep respect. Therefore, in this week's Torah portion, Tazria and then Metzorah, which is later on, which deals with afflictions of body and various elements of skin care and so forth that need to be. One thing becomes very, one moment, just. One thing becomes clear from the Torah portion is that when the person is not right, they're in their appearance due to their skin condition, they're placed outside the camp. And it's a painful place to be, like the painful place to be outside of the realms of the communal conversation. So with that sensitivity, I appreciate the research, honesty, daring, inquisitive mind who would like to understand and to help to think through these very, in many ways, non-popular conversations that we need to have as living in today's age. And I think deep care and profound honor and respect is where the camp is expanded, and all of us can sit with a variety of opinions and views to hear one another. So just want to say thank you, and may this open ourselves for these heartfelt exchanges. So with God's help, welcome.
Thank you, Rabbi. Nora?
Yes, hello. Thank you for that beautiful introduction, Rabbi. So I'm going to share my screen now. So tonight I'm going to talk to you on a couple of topics, including Dying with Dignity Canada and medical assistance in dying. There is a lot of talk about death and dying these days. It seems like they're reported in unbelievable numbers in our social media, on the news. And so our thoughts are very much on the topic of death and dying. Let me tell you a little bit about why I am sitting here today talking to you about this topic. My name is Nora Ohanjanians, and I have watched three people that I loved very dearly die extended, protracted, suffering deaths. One of them was my mom. She had Alzheimer's for the last 17 years of her life. Once she started to lose her faculties, she did not want to live. She asked me repeatedly to help her die, but I couldn't. And that was very heartbreaking. MAID wasn't legal then. And even if it was legal, I don't think she would have qualified with all the restrictions that are in place on it now. When my turn comes, if that's the kind of death I'm going to face, I would want to have a choice. If living looks scarier than dying, then I would like to have the help to put an end to my suffering. I'd like to share with you the objectives of this talk. They're very simple, really. If you have the knowledge of the options available to you, you can make informed choices in your planning and decision-making, and ultimately you can have more control of your end-of-life situation. The agenda for this meeting is as follows. I'm going to talk about who we are at Dying with Dignity Canada, what is MAID, Medical Assistance in Dying, how MAID became to be legal in Canada, the MAID legislation, and so on, the MAID eligibility process, what is new. Many of you have heard about Bill C7, which was a change to the original legislation that made MAID legal, which was called Bill C14. Then we're going to talk about what's on the horizon, anticipated changes to the legislation. And in the end, my associate, Roz Doctorow, who is a subject matter expert, will answer questions that you might have. So, an introduction to Dying with Dignity Canada. We are a human rights charity. We have over 2,500 members. We started in Ontario and grew to be a national organization. In 2020, we celebrated the 40th anniversary of Dying with Dignity Canada, advocating for the right to choose how and when we die. What do? We defend human rights by advocating for assisted dying rules that respect the Canadian Constitution and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We get no government funding. We are funded by average Canadians that want a better way to die. A recent Ipsos Reid poll showed that 85% of Canadians support MAID for those that meet the eligibility criteria. Our focus is in 4 areas. In terms of eligibility, we ensure that assisted dying legislation complies with the Canadian Constitution and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In terms of access, we work to ensure that Canadians can access MAID in compliance with the Constitution and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We support people, their families, caregivers, and healthcare professionals as they explore end-of-life options, including MAID. We lead education initiatives, such as the one we're doing tonight, for healthcare professionals and the public on patients' rights, end-of-life options, including MAID, and advanced care planning. How do we do this? We support and intervene in court challenges related to Bill C-14, the federal legislation that allows for MAID. We work to ensure that clinicians who object to MAID are obliged to provide effective referrals for those seeking MAID. And we provide information, emotional, and personal support resources to those interested in MAID. Let's define medical assistance in dying. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to read these. So MAID is the administration of a substance that causes death by a medical or nurse practitioner, or the prescription and providing of the substance to the person that causes their death on their request. Notice that in both cases, MAID is provided on the person's request. Let's see how MAID became legal in Canada. Here are 3 women who were instrumental in paving the way for the legalization of MAID. The top picture is of Sue Rodriguez. In 1993, Sue Rodriguez was 42 years old and suffering from ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. She wanted MAID, and she took her case all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. And she said, if I cannot give consent to my own death, whose body is this? Who owns my life? The Supreme Court of Canada upheld the criminal code provision in a 5-4 decision. In other words, it remained a crime to assist someone in dying. In 1994, with the assistance of an anonymous doctor, Sue Rodriguez took her own life by drinking a liquid mixture of morphine and secobarbital. Fast forward 20 years, we meet 2 other women who were important in the fight to make MAID legal in Canada. Gloria Taylor, lower left, who was suffering from ALS, joined Kay Carter on the right, who was suffering from degenerative spinal stenosis, to change history. Unfortunately, neither woman lived to see it, but both fought vigorously in court on behalf of all Canadians for the right to die with dignity. Kay Carter got her assisted death in Switzerland in 2010, the only country that allowed non-residents this option. And Gloria Taylor died of a severe infection in 2012. On February 6, 2015, the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in Carter versus Canada case was released. The Supreme Court of Canada determined unanimously that the prohibition on assisted dying infringes on individuals' Section 7 rights to life, liberty, and security of the person. So before, it was 5-4 against MAID, and now it was unanimous for MAID. The resulting MAID legislation, Bill C-14, was put into law in June of 2016, not very long ago. From June 2016 to the end of 2020, 21,589 Canadians have accessed and assisted death to release them from their pain and suffering. Let's look at MAID in more detail. The decision to seek MAID is not undertaken lightly, and certain criteria must be met. The person has to be eligible for publicly funded health services in Canada, which is OHIP in Ontario. They have to be mentally competent, which means have the capacity to make their own healthcare decisions and be at least 18 years of age. They have to have a grievous and irremediable condition. We're going to talk about that in a minute. The request must be voluntary. The two people who assess them have to make sure that there are no signs of coercion or pressure. And they must be aware of all the medical options available to them so that they can make an informed decision to pursue MAID and ultimately give their final consent. Now let's go back to this term, grievous and irremediable. What does that mean? It means that the person must have an incurable disease, illness, or disability. That said illness, disease, or disability has to be in an advanced state of decline which cannot be reversed. They have to experience unbearable physical and emotional or mental suffering from this illness, disease, and disability that cannot be relieved under conditions that are acceptable to them. And the last criterion is their natural death must be reasonably foreseeable. That is put in red because it requires more discussion. And it was the focus of a relatively recent legislation and the articles you might have read about it. As you know, Bill C-7 makes this reasonably foreseeable death, allows people whose death is not reasonably foreseeable to seek MAID. Here are two people who challenged this criterion. Jean Touchon, who suffered from cerebral palsy, and Nicole Gladue, who suffered from post-polio syndrome, in 2019 took their case all the way to the Supreme Court of Quebec to challenge BC-14 regarding this eligibility criterion for reasonably foreseeable death in order to access MAID. The Quebec court ruled that the need for a reasonably foreseeable death in order to be eligible for MAID is unconstitutional. The federal government accepted this decision and as a result drafted Bill C-7, which was a further amendment to the Canadian Criminal Code and broadened the eligibility criteria for MAID. In March of 2021, just a year ago, Bill C-7 received royal assent and became law. Bill C-7 now allows for persons whose death is not reasonably foreseeable to request and seek approval for MAID. However, this now leaves us with a two-tier system. Those whose death is reasonably foreseeable and those whose death is not reasonably foreseeable. Let's talk very briefly about what was the problem with this criterion. First of all, it was a very ambiguous legal term, and it became difficult for clinicians to interpret it. It excluded chronically ill Canadians with enduring pain and intolerable suffering. And it created inconsistencies around access to MAID, depending on which medical professional assessed you and how they interpreted then the term when determining eligibility. And that is one of the things that Bill C-7 changed. Now those whose death is not reasonably foreseeable are able to apply for and pursue MAID. So as I mentioned, that leaves us with a two-track system. As of March 17, 2021, safeguards are based on whether one's natural death is reasonably foreseeable or not reasonably foreseeable. In terms of making the initial written request, if death is reasonably foreseeable, then the person must must have been told that their condition is irremediable by their healthcare provider and acknowledge that they have been informed of all the means available to them to relieve suffering, including palliative care. If death is not reasonably foreseeable, then the person must not only be informed of all the available and appropriate means to relieve their suffering, including counseling services, mental health and disability support services, community services, and palliative care. They must be offered consultations with professionals who provide those services. And both they and their practitioners have to agree that all alternative means to relieve their suffering have been considered. So those are some important safeguards. In terms of medical assessors, any two medical professionals can assess a person whose death is reasonably foreseeable. They don't need to have expertise in a certain medical field. Whereas in the case of a person whose death is not reasonably foreseeable, one of the people who are assessing them have to have expertise in the condition that's causing their suffering. For example, in the case of Nicole Gladue, it must have been someone with expertise in post-polio syndrome. If the first two assessors do not have such expertise, there has to be a third assessor who has that expertise for a person whose death is not reasonably foreseeable. After the two independent assessors determined eligibility for MAID, a person whose death is reasonably foreseeable has no waiting period. Whereas for the person whose death is not reasonably foreseeable, there is a 90-day waiting, quote unquote, reflection period, starting from the date of the first assessment. Again, that's an important safeguard. And the final consent may be waived for a person whose death is reasonably foreseeable, but must be given for a person whose death is not reasonably foreseeable. Let's see how the MAID process rolls out. The first step is when a person makes the initial inquiry about their end-of-life options. The doctor or nurse practitioner has to provide end-of-life options like treatment, palliative care, and MAID. The response to that request must include the option of MAID. What happens if the doctor doesn't support medical assistant in dying due to their own personal beliefs? Well, in Ontario, the doctor is compelled to refer the patient to make an effective referral to an available, accessible physician or agency that is willing to facilitate a request for assisted dying. What's the next step? The person seeking MAID must write a written request. In Ontario, it's called Clinician Aid A form. There are other forms, but that one is the most widely used. This form, no one else but the person who's requesting MAID can fill out a written request for MAID. This form establishes the eligibility of the person to proceed with the process. It establishes that you're capable of making the request. This means that your request for MAID cannot be initiated by anybody else. And it shows that you have a clear understanding of your medical condition. It also shows that you have been informed of all the other means that are available to you to relieve your pain and suffering. The signing of the written request has to be witnessed by one independent witness who has to meet specific criteria. If the person who's writing the written request cannot physically write and sign and date their request, an authorized third person may do that on their behalf and at their request, who has to meet the same criteria that the independent witness has to meet. I have to mention, making the written request does not mean that you have to go through with MAID. This is all about making an informed decision. The third step is the assessment. A doctor or a nurse practitioner meets the person to determine, first, if their condition is grievous and irremediable. Second, if they are competent in their decision-making. This may include more than one meeting, more than one clinician, and the review of all the medical records for that person. A second independent assessor has to meet with the person and do the same, go through the same process. If two assessors independently agree that all the criteria are met, a MAID procedure can then be planned for reasonably foreseeable deaths. If the person is not happy with the assessment, they can always request a third or fourth assessment. For non-reasonably foreseeable death, there is they require an expert assessor in the condition that they're suffering from to do the assessment, and there is a 90-day reflection period. The next step is, whoops, sorry, I went 2 slides down. Once the procedure is scheduled, the MAID provider issues a prescription and picks up the drugs that are to be administered on the day the MAID is provided or self-administered. Prior to administering the drugs to the person receiving MAID, they are asked to give a final consent for the procedure to the provider. This can be a verbal consent or a physical consent if the person cannot speak, like a nod of the head, or the person can decline the procedure. At any point throughout the procedure, the person can decline the procedure. They don't have to go through with it. If the consent is waived or given, then the drugs are administered for a quiet and peaceful death that is not painful at all. It takes about 10 minutes. Death is pronounced and certificate of death is issued. If anybody is interested in personal stories of experiences about MAID, they can go to the Dying with Dignity Canada website and read the blog posts there. There are some very heartfelt stories there. Let me introduce you to another woman who was instrumental in bringing about legislative change. This is a picture of Audrey Parker. In 2018, Audrey Parker was suffering, a woman from Halifax was suffering from stage 4 breast cancer that had metastasized to her brain. She chose MAID. She wanted one more Christmas with her family before accessing MAID, but she was afraid that she wouldn't be mentally competent to give the final consent if she waited an additional month till Christmas. So she chose to die earlier than she wanted to. She chose to have MAID in November instead of after Christmas. Audrey realized there was a big flaw in the legislation, as did others. Bill C7 now contains Audrey's amendment in the form of the waiver of the final consent. If that was the case when Audrey was alive, Audrey could have signed a waiver of final consent and spent one last Christmas with her family. Let's look at what's up ahead. After Bill C7 became law, a joint committee of the Parliament and the Senate was formed, which was going to do a comprehensive review of the MAID legislation over the next year. This parliamentary committee was going to review some important issues and come up with some important safeguards. The committee was going to consider advance requests. So anyone with the onset of dementia could hopefully be able to have an advanced request in which they could say, come the day that I can't recognize anyone, or I can't feed myself or look after myself, I want medical assistance in dying. Mental illness as the sole underlying medical condition has been excluded from the legislation for a period of 2 years. During this time, the Government of Canada will hear from experts and develop safeguards and protocols for people who seek access to MAID with mental illness being their sole condition. The Joint Committee was also going to consider eligibility of mature minors, defined by law as a person under 18 who has the intelligence, the maturity, and capacity to understand the nature, the purpose, and the consequences of such a decision. The federal election resulted in the dissolution of the Joint Committee, which will hopefully be reconstituted soon and continue its work. The timelines will be determined by the government. Let me summarize the key takeaway points from this presentation. MAID is legal in Canada, and you're right as a Canadian. It's important to know all end-of-life options in making your end-of-life choices and thereby having control over your end-of-life situation. No one else but you can request MAID or give consent to the MAID procedure on your behalf. And the most important one, or one of the very important ones, a request for MAID can be withdrawn at any time and not be acted upon. I'll let you read this beautiful quote. MAID allows for planning, being in the place you want, having the people and the things you want to be surrounded by at the end of your life is very reassuring and comforting, both to the person and their family and friends. MAID has been described by both the providers and those present as being very comforting and peaceful. At Dying with Dignity Canada, we believe everyone has a right to choose a good death. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. We now have we have time for questions now. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, direct them to me, and let me remind you again that if you have not registered, please put your email in the chat and direct it to Simon Shapiro. So the first question, I do have some questions people had already submitted, and as you might guess, some of them have been answered in the presentation by Nora. But Roz, are we ready?
Yes.
Okay, so the first question that I want to ask is, and it's come up a couple times, is how long it takes from the time, typically from the time someone initiates a request, goes to their doctor, until the death actually happens, the procedure actually happens. Because there are a number of steps.
Yes, you heard Nora go through the steps, and as she said, there are 2 tracks right now with the new legislation. So once somebody decides that they would like to request medical assistance in dying, they would get a form that they would complete, and the form can be found on the Dying with Dignity Canada website, or it's in the Ontario Ministry of Health documents. And you would complete that form and request from Dying with Dignity that they send a witness over to witness your completion of the form, your signature on the form. They would be speaking with you and making some decisions about whether or not you were of sound mind. They would be able to make that kind of a judgment. But you would, once you've signed that form and it's been witnessed, you would then have to have 2 independent medical practitioners come and assess you and agree that, in fact, you are suffering from a grievous and irremediable illness. And if, as Nora said, you're suffering from an illness which from which you will not survive much longer, the term is basically your death is reasonably foreseeable. Once that decision has been made, you determine yourself when you would like to have your procedure completed. So depending on how soon you can see a witness, when the doctors can come and see you, it can be quite quick once you've made that decision. It's really up to you how much time you want to take in between deciding on MAID and having MAID completed. If, however, you are not suffering from an illness from which your death is reasonably foreseeable, you have to go through a number of different processes, and you have to be seen not just by 2 independent physicians, but one of them has to be an expert in the field of medicine that you're suffering from. And there's a 90-day waiting period of reflection after the procedure, after you've gone through all of the examinations, you've tried all the various options in terms of alternatives, palliative care, different medications, counseling. All of that has been has been completed, and you still would like the procedure because your suffering is so you can't live any longer with that suffering. So that process takes quite a bit longer. There are safeguards really ensuring that you've really thought this through. And so that's how it happens and how it should happen in Ontario. Of course, all of it depends on people being available. Things are difficult now because of the pandemic, but this is the process that you would go through.
Okay. A couple people have asked about MAID in terms of people with Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. Obviously,
Sure.
the big issue is giving consent.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the big issue.
Exactly. So again, in the legislation right now, you cannot be considered for medical assistance in dying if you have Alzheimer's. If you have dementia and you have other underlying causes, and your dementia is at a point where you can still express yourself and express your desires, then you can request MAID. But once you reach a point where you really are not of sound mind, you can't give consent and you cannot access MAID. So in Nora's presentation, she talked about this committee that still has not been struck, although we've been given really assurances by the Liberal government that it's coming very soon. One of the things they're going to consider is something called an advance request. And an advance request can be made by someone who perhaps has a long family history of Alzheimer's and are looking ahead and seeing what their parents have gone through, what siblings, other relatives have gone through. And if the advance request is made into legislation, then there will be an opportunity for someone to say, look, at this point, I'm not ready, I'm perfectly happy and perfectly fine. But if I reach a point where I can no longer, as Nora indicated, take care of myself, whatever the conditions are, then at that point, you would be able to have medical assistance in dying. And that request needs to be, I think, made to, we talked about advanced care planning in the last seminar. So you need to have somebody who's going to make sure that that request is followed through. And that would be a substitute decision maker that you've selected and is determined and understands what your wishes are and is named in your power of attorney. And so when that person sees that you have reached that point in your life where you had requested that at this time you would want medical assistance in dying, they would ensure that whatever needs to happen happens so that your suffering doesn't have to be endured any longer.
But just to be clear, you have to make that request and they get to implement it when the criteria are met. Is that correct?
That's right, because you would be at a point where you wouldn't be able to go through with it, make that request on your own.
Okay.
So the substitute decision maker, it's really important that it's somebody that you know will be able to follow through on the request that you've made, and you've talked to that person, they know what's going on, they've watched you through all of this time, through all of this suffering. I actually just experienced this with someone who was the substitute decision maker for her sister-in-law. Her sister-in-law had pancreatic cancer and had told her that she doesn't, when she reaches the point where she can't go on any longer, she would like medical assistance in dying. But by then, the siblings of this woman had taken over, they'd taken control, and the substitute decision maker couldn't step on their toes. And her poor sister-in-law really, really suffered in her final days and weeks of life, because her sister-in-law really could not speak for her and overrule her brothers. So you have to be really sure of the person that you're selecting and asking to be your substitute decision maker. They're your mouthpiece. They're going to speak for you.
Okay, thank you, Roz. I now have a question for Rabbi Tina, which is basically, what is the Jewish position on medical assistance in dying? Or maybe I should say Jewish positions, because I think there are probably many. You're muted, Rabbi.
Right. So first of all, thank you very much for for this. It's very informative and very clearly laid out. So let me just say that I don't think, at least in my experience of religious traditions, there would be any tradition that would be would receive this with great enthusiasm and support. Saying that, watching people suffer in a hospital at the end of life is their torment, and the torment of their families is very profound and real. And I speak from a place of a person, and I have to be careful, who gets up in the morning for now with no pain. And it is one very important place to recognize the distinction. So I don't think that I have ever been around any death that was not dignified. Every death is the place of courage. Every death is a place of dignity for the one who is dying and for the one who is witnessing or trying to relieve the pain. Orthodox Judaism, conservative Judaism, Reform Judaism, and Reconstructionist Judaism all view life as a sacred journey. And the suicide in general is not supported, to say the least. There are some outstanding opinions of more liberal rabbis on their own who might have voiced it in a different way. The mainstream of all movements would not be supported. Said all that, it doesn't mean you would not be buried in a Jewish cemetery, considering that suicide is often viewed as a form of an illness preceding to it, and therefore the person would be embraced and treated as all other person who has happened to face their death. So they're not placed in any way outside of the circle I'm talking about, but within the Jewish realm. From very, Mishnah has, this is the Jewish oral tradition, has this wonderful commentary on the fact that Adam, why does the world starts with one person and one family, Adam and Eve, is because we have all people are a family, and by destroying one life, you destroy the whole world. So Adam is in his life and his birth and death is in a place of sacred. So even in Jewish tradition, where when the worst time we have faced, profound suffering, including, face of Holocaust and other horrific oppressions, l'chaim, it's to life. In a purely pastoral sense, my experience and exposure to medically assisted dying always stands in a bracket of assistance at birth. So in other words, if we can command life, which we do, we can, life can be created in a petri dish, and we're in the modern world has determined that we can also place the embryo in someone else's body. And then, so we created these marvelous ways of creating life and sustaining life. Then looking at the end of our life is a very logical, and being in control is a very logical evolution of where we are as a humanity. Settle that, counseling people from families where parents have chosen to leave this world. I do have to say that I have heard on several occasions, the children and grandchildren would say, I wish my grandmother felt that I was worthy to stick around for. So it's not simple with what death leaves behind. Death is messy anyway, in general, and suffering is messy. So there are distinctions and there are different categories. I cannot separate them, nor can I say it's okay, I'm not God. It's okay here, but not okay there. What I want to say is it's complex. It's not univocal at all. It's multivocal in its responses. And one has to treat this with an incredible care and caution, profound caution with one appears approaching something like this. So I welcome and appreciate this honest conversation and complicated conversation, and in many ways painful conversation, because medical assisted dying does not also lives outside of loneliness, isolation, lack of community, lack of support, and profound deep connections to humanity around us. We've created a lonely world. We did. And the role of the tradition is, and families and friendships and connections, is to help individuals and people to come to that difficult place in their life, sustained, loved, and cherished. So I'm not able to say any more other than there is no definite position other than negative. And I'm saying this with a great deal of caution and profound respect for people's suffering and pain. Complicated it is.
It is indeed. Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. Another question from the chat. Somebody has asked, were the legal challenge cases mentioned by Nora, were they supported by Dying with Dignity Canada? And in what way? What did you do anything to support them? Roz, sorry.
That's a good question. Actually, I was listening to a webinar this afternoon where they spoke to the son of the woman who went to Switzerland, and the friend, Audrey's friend, who had medical assistance in dying early because she was afraid that she wouldn't be able to give consent. And there was the third person, I can't remember who it was, somebody who was involved in MAID just after the legislation. Dying with Dignity, I believe, was there to support them. And I don't know precisely what they did, but I know that Dying with Dignity certainly has been there to support in these changes in the legislation, and to be there for these very early pioneers in Canada to help make these changes to the legislation. Nora, I don't know if you know any more about the role of Dying with Dignity in these early cases.
I really don't know. No, I can't say. Now that you're talking, I saw a program that was about the Carter case. It was a documentary, but I don't remember Dying with Dignity's role, or if they had any role. I don't know. Sorry.
Yeah. But certainly Dying with Dignity does play an advocacy role in helping to move the legislation forward.
Okay. Does anybody else have questions that they would like to send me in the chat? If not, I don't see any. So I think we'll call the evening to a close. A couple things I want to remind you of. We're now going to send you an evaluation form. That form from Dying with Dignity Canada, the form will be in the chat. If you click on it in the chat, you can then complete it right away. And I can see it in the chat right there. So if you open your chat, you will also see it. Click on it and complete the evaluation form. We'll leave the Zoom open for a while so that you can complete the form and return it.
Can I, Nora,
Yes.
sorry, can I just suggest that if somebody does have a question that they think of, could they send it to you, Myra, and you could forward it to us and then we could respond to it privately?
Sure, that would be fine. I'd be happy to do
Thank
that.
you.
And just to clarify, clicking on the link for the survey will take you to another window. It's not the Zoom window. So the Zoom doesn't need to be open while you complete that
Oh, okay.
survey.
That's how technical I am. So I'd like to conclude by obviously thanking you all for coming, but most importantly, thanking our presenters, Roz and Nora and Rabbi Tina, and thanking Dying with Dignity for Canada for organizing and putting together this really impressive presentation on this really important topic. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all very, very much.